trying to get across with all of his details back and forth. And that's what Talmud from the Balcony, when we started a year and a half ago, and we were doing that in person at Hartman in New York, started as the idea of basically saying to everybody, Talmud can be accessible to anyone, but it's not just about learning to read the words. And it's not just about learning to figure out the rhythms. It's actually trying to figure out what philosophy is happening here, because there's a lot of it. And for that, you need to be willing to delve into the details and then to get up on the balcony and look at what it all means. And I want to do that tonight. But of course, Talmud from the Balcony takes on a whole different meaning in the time of COVID. And my colleague, Rabbi Justice Baird, pointed out to me a couple of weeks ago something that it's just buoyed me throughout this situation, and I hope that it will continue to buoy me and many others, and especially people who are rabbinating, as I like to call it, in this situation, who are rabbis, who are educators, who are teachers in this moment, which is, he pointed out to me that during the mid-17th century, we actually have cases of rabbis giving drashot, giving their sermons from their balconies in a time of a plague. The example he gave me was a Rabbi Jacob Zahalon in 1656 during a plague in Italy. He would stand on his balcony on Shabbat morning and preach to the people below. And not only would he do it, but he writes in his own testimonials that you could hear rabbis from all different balconies throughout the Italian ghetto crying out their sermons to the people. Zoom has become our balcony. And tonight, in advance of Shabbat HaGadol, the Shabbat preceding Pesach, there are so many people who are on the Zoom balcony tonight teaching Torah. And it is just, it's incredible. The hope, the faith, the belief, the connection. Now, unfortunately, if we were doing Talmud from the Balcony together, we'd be able to see each other. We're using the Zoom webinar format because we're trying to prevent what's known as Zoom bombing, and also because there are a lot of people signed up. So we can't see each other. But what I'd like to do is I'd still like us to be able to participate and have our thoughts shared, not just my thoughts, but your thoughts shared throughout this hour together. And so you'll notice on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A function. If you click on it, you'll actually be able to write in your questions and what I'm going to do, or your comments for that matter. And what I'm going to do is every so often, I'm going to pause to take questions and comments, and I might ask you, or I'd like to ask you to actually be able to state your question or your comment. And my colleague, Michael Groomer, who's working behind the scenes here, will unmute you. So whether you're joining us because we know each other already, whether you're joining us through the Hartman community, whether you're joining us through Jewish Live, don't be shy. Put your comments, put your questions in that Q&A box. We want to hear you and not just me, even though I have something to say. So tonight, I think befitting Shabbat HaGadol, which is actually named for the Shabbat on which the Jewish people were to take the actual lamb that they were going to use for the Paschal lamb in Egypt a few days later. So Shabbat HaGadol, we are going to talk about the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb. Now you may say, oh, really? That's what we're going to talk about right now? And my answer is, yes, really, that's what we're going to talk about right now. The reason we're going to talk about it is because it was the centerpiece of the Jewish experience of Pesach. Allow me to explain what that looked like. It looked like the following. Erev Pesach, the day before Pesach began, meaning Pesach would begin at nightfall. That day, throngs and throngs of people would show up outside of the temple and wait, literally in 3 separate groups, and wait to have their korban, to have their Paschal offering offered. And the Levites, the Levites would be singing the Hallel. They'd be singing praise. And literally you would see the gathering of the Jewish people, the gathering of the Jewish people. That was the centerpiece of Pesach. And then everybody would go home and eat that night. They would eat their Korban Pesach. And that was the centerpiece. And what I want to understand is, what is it that Korban Pesach, something that we haven't done in 2,000 years, although, by the way, Samaritans do it every year in Israel. And there's a group that petitions the High Court in Jerusalem to do it every year on the Temple Mount. But that's a different conversation. What is it that emotive, experiential Korban Pesach can do for us, can teach us in a time when many of us are not just not going to be eating Korban Pesach, but we're going to be a party of one. We're going to be eating by ourselves. We're not going to be with throngs of people. We're not even going to be with two people. We're going to be sitting by ourselves at a table, having our Pesach meal. And so I want to talk about it. In order to talk about it, I'm going to ask you to look at the source sheet. Now, we sent out the source sheet, and I think there is a link to the source sheet in the chat box. If there isn't a link, I'm sure my colleagues who are a little bit better at tech than I am at this point because they have more practice will put those up. But hopefully everybody has a source sheet. I want to start simply with number one. I want to start with the biblical account of the first Korban Pesach, of the first Paschal lamb. And we're going to read it together. And I'm going to ask you a question, not because I'm going to ask you to answer the question just yet. And by the way, Justice Baird just put up in the chat box the link to the source sheet if people need it. I'm going to ask you to think about the following question as we're reading this. What's missing? Okay? What's missing is my question. We're looking at Shemot, Exodus chapter 12. Source number 1 in your packet. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, Dabru el kol adat Yisrael limor. On the 10th day of the month, the Asor lachodesh hazeh, they should take for themselves every person a lamb, v'ikhu lahem ish se leveit avot, according to their father's houses, a lamb for each household, se labait. And if the household is too little to eat a whole lamb, v'im yimat habayit miyot miseh, then what you should do is you should join with your neighbor in the house next door, v'lakahu ushcheno hakarov el beito, to be a group together, b'michsat nefashot. Everyone according to what they can eat, tachosu alaseh, ish lefi achlo tachosu alaseh. Everyone according to what they can eat, that's how you decide how many people are going to be in your group. And let me tell you a little bit more about this about this lamb. It has to be unblemished, tamim. It has to be male and within its first year, zachar ben shana. That's what it's going to be for you. And it has to come from the sheep or from the goats. Min hakvasim umin ha'izim tikachu. And you have to keep it from the 10th day when you get it until the 14th day. Vayalachem l'mishmeret arba'asar yom l'chodesh hazeh. And then you're going to, or they're going to, the people of Israel are going to slaughter it. V'shachatu oto kol kal adat Yisrael, all of the congregation of Israel, ben ha'arbayim, in the afternoon. And they're going to take from the blood, v'lakhu min adam, and they're going to put it on the 2 doorposts, v'natnu al shtei hamezuzot, and they're going to put it on the lintel, ve'al mashkof, and al habatim, on the houses, asher yochlu tabahem, that they're going to be eating this Korban Pesach therein. And they're going to eat, verse 8, they're going to eat that meat, ve'achlu tabasar, sorry to all the vegetarians and vegans, okay? They're going to eat that meat, v'layla hazeh, on this night. Sli eish, it's got to be roasted, meaning you're not going to boil it, you're going to roast it. Umatzot, and it's going to be with matzah, al mirorim, and on maror, herbs, yochluhu, they're going to eat it. And by the way, you can't eat it raw, also and explicitly, you can't eat it boiled, it can't be boiled, but instead it must be roasted. And let me tell you, it has to be roasted like on a spit, rosho al kra'av ve'al kirbo, its head and its legs with its innards. I know, hard, not so yummy to imagine right now, but just think of the end product, it's not the as it's happening. And don't leave any over until the morning, menu at boker, and anything that's left over till the morning, you got to burn it. Now, here's what I see. I see an offering that looks a lot like an offering. I mean, if you read about korbanot in the Torah, you'll see there are plenty of things where you have to take something that is a certain age, the animal has to be a certain age, and the animal has to be a certain gender, and all korbanot, all offerings have to be tamim. They all have to be unblemished, right? And we have lots of categories for what blemishes are in korbanot. There's even descriptions of korbanot is that, you put them, the head and the different parts of it, the different parts of the body, trying not to get too graphic. You put them together when you dismember them, like exactly as is described in verse 9. I mean, it's literally verbatim. And we also have a prohibition of leaving stuff over past the time when you're supposed to eat. It's called notar, literally leftovers. You're not supposed to do that with korbanot. Every korban has a certain amount of time that you can eat it. So what I see here is I see a korban. I see an offering, but there's something missing here. What's missing? Well, I'll tell you what I don't see. I don't see any offering to God. I thought the idea of a korban, the idea of an offering is that you're offering something to God, right? I don't see anything going to the Kohen. I don't see anything going to the priest. Like if you were eating a regular, what's called shlamim, an offering where you get to eat some of it, you give some of it to the priest. I don't even see any priests in here. I don't see a temple. I don't see an altar. And in fact, I put in green all the times we see the word house or household. It's in your house. There's something very strange about trying to pass off a communal korban as something that you do in your house without priests, without an altar, actually offering nothing to God. Very strange. And so the rabbis pick up on this, and they essentially ask in number 2, in the Talmud, they ask, like, where's the offering part that goes to God? And in fact, it's not just the offering part that goes to God, it's also there are certain parts of the animal that you're not allowed to eat. Those are actually the parts that would go on the altar in this kind of situation. There are certain fasts that you're not supposed to eat. So the Gemara asks in number 2, Babylonian Talmud in Psachim, the tractate that is about Pesach, as you might have understood. By Rabbi Zera asks, the sacrificial portions of the Paschal Lamb, a Murei Pesach Mitzrayim, in Egypt, where did they burn them? Where there's the essential part of the korban is missing. So Amar le Abaye says, what kind of question is that? Uman lemalan delo shviski avud. Maybe they roasted them too and they ate them too, meaning they don't have any rules yet about not eating certain fasts. Abaye doesn't seem to be worried about the question, and it's almost like, well, this isn't like anything else. Maybe it's proto-korban, it's not real, but there really is a question here. How is this a korban if you're not actually giving anything to God? Ve'od, and another answer, Hatana Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Shlosha mizbechot hayusham. Actually, there were 3 altars in the case of the Paschal lamb that was offered in Egypt. Al hamashkof, on the lintel, 1 altar, the al shtei hamezuzot, and on the 2 posts. The 2 midyacharina lo haba, and there was no other altar. In other words, well, there is somewhat of an altar here, which is that they put the blood somewhere, right? They had to take the hyssop grass and they had to dip it in the blood and they had to put it on the doorpost and put it on the lintel. Rav Yosef is suggesting there is an altar here. Sure, they're not burning fat on it. That's not something they're going to be able to do in their house. But the altar is their house. The temple is their house. To my mind, the idea that actually Korban Pesach did not start as something that thousands of people attended and that was out in public and that had singing of Hallel around, but it actually was something that was deeply private. And it was actually something that within the home tells us something. Now, we can put it in the direction, we can put it in lots of directions. I'm going to put it in a very positive spin, and then I'm going to put a less positive spin on it because I'm a realist too. Let's put a positive spin on it. What is this trying to say? It's trying to say that actually you don't first need Kohanim. The Jewish people are supposed to be God's Kohanim. The Jewish people are supposed to be God's priestly nation. And so our first Korban, we do it ourselves in our home. Our homes are supposed to be places of Kiddusha, places of holiness, and places of refuge. We actually know throughout the Bible, the Mizbeach, the altar, is actually considered a place of refuge. There are several less savory characters who are trying to keep themselves from getting the death penalty, and they run to the altar in the first book of Kings, and they hold on to the altar, hoping that they won't get their capital punishment if they stay in the sanctuary of the sanctuary, literally. And so literally in Egypt, as plague is hitting everyone around them, the Jewish people go into, or the Israelites go into their altar, their refuge, their sanctuary, and proclaim within all of that craziness that we have holiness here. We have asylum, we have safety, and we have Kiddusha, God's presence here in our home. Now, this explains some interesting things. It explains, by the way, why this whole thing revolves around Makat Bechorot, the death of the firstborn in Egypt. Because what we're looking at here is the night of the firstborn, where firstborn Israelites are saved, essentially. It's every home has a firstborn. Before the sin of the golden calf, it was the firstborns who were supposed to be the priests. So this really is instantiating a sense of being a priestly nation to the Jewish people. This also explains why you can't take the Korban out of your house. If you read Shemot 12 and 13, you will find you can't take the Korban. They weren't allowed to take the Korban out of their houses. Why? Because their houses were the sanctum. It also explains why they weren't allowed to have chametz. Or maybe it's the reverse, because we actually find in Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 20, that you're not ever allowed to have chametz on the altar in the actual tabernacle. You're not ever allowed to have chametz there. So maybe it's getting its feed from the fact that they weren't allowed to have chametz and their homes are the original altar, or maybe the reverse. Maybe they're not allowed to have chametz because in the first Pesach, we're not up to where they bake their dough and it didn't get to ripe. Maybe we're not allowed to have chametz because you're never allowed to have chametz on the altar, and then we can figure out like what are the big ideas there. But there's something here that is really deeply personal about Korban Pesach. And I want to add one more layer, and then I want to open to comments or questions before we move on to the rabbinic layer, because actually I think this is very much the biblical layer of what's going on. The Rambam Maimonides makes a really interesting point about the Korban Pesach. He says usually we have two types of korbanot. We have two main types of offerings. One is called the Korban Tzibur. That is the Korban that is given on behalf of the community. The money for it comes from the communal coffer. It's not something that I participate in as someone who is just a regular person living. It's something that the Kohen does on everyone's behalf, on holidays, every day, in the morning, in the afternoon. It's not something that the average person even sees. I mean, it represents us, but it represents us as a community, as individuals. We're really not engaged in it at all. And those korbanot, those sacrifices, tend to be sacrifices that are tied to a certain date on the calendar. You have to do this sacrifice on Shabbat. You have to do this sacrifice on Rosh Hashanah. You have to do this sacrifice on Rosh Chodesh, on the first of the month. They tend to have a zman kavua, a particular time when they have to be done. And in fact, that particular time is so important that even if it's Shabbat, it happens on Shabbat, right? There's another type of korban category called Korban Yachid. The Korban of the individual. A Korban of an individual is something that an individual partakes in because of something that happened in their lives. They sinned, something great happened to them, they feel like they want to be magnanimous and they want to offer to God, right? It's the same way we would, do philanthropy, or we would make a special gathering for our friends, right? Maybe out of the goodness of our hearts, maybe we actually have a responsibility to do it because we did something wrong. And Maimonides says, and those korbanot tend not to be connected to a date. They're connected to what happened in my life. I sinned this week, I'm going to get it next week if I can get there. But it's not that suddenly on the 10th of Nisan, I have to do this. And the Rambam Maimonides points out that actually the Korban Pesach is an outlier, because the Korban Pesach is an individual Korban. It's a Korban Yachid. Every individual, not that every individual literally slaughters it, but every individual has to somehow be included in the Korban Pesach, and each group of individuals that's eating Korban Pesach together has an ambassador who goes to slaughter it for them to the temple. So every single person, and yet it also is like a Korban Tzibur. It's also like a communal offering because it has a particular date, and even if Pesach fell on Shabbat, or Erev Pesach fell on Shabbat, we would have to do it then. So he says it's this hybrid, which you can feel, which is also indicated by this idea that the first time it's done inside the household. That, I think, is the positive spin. There's so much there, and it's beautiful. I think there's also something that we have to be honest with ourselves about, which is that actually the biblical version of the Korban Pesach is very traumatic. It's very traumatic. Think about it. They're hunkering down in their homes, and outside is chaos. Outside is danger. Literally, the way the Torah describes it is there is a mashchit, there is a destroyer out there killing at random, and anyone who's out there could get hurt. There is such resonance to that idea that actually this is not a great feeling. This is not, let's sanctify in our homes. And there's fear. There's a lot of fear of being in your home during all of that. And some of that fear and some of that perspective of the altar as a refuge is actually something that dissipates when you're able to have the temple with thousands of people all together and it's public and you feel like you've arrived in a different kind of way. And so I want to pay homage to the fact that having it in the house can both be a way to deepen what it means, what the home means, and what that safety is. And it also can be a way to accentuate the fact that you're not able to go out, to accentuate the danger that is outside. And I know that I feel both of those things right now. The ability to actually deepen my relationship with my family, deepen my understanding of what's going on with my children, deepen my understanding of myself, and also tremendous fear of going outside. The idea that you're safe if you're inside, but who knows what happens to you if you go outside. There's something for right now that this actually holds for us. I want to pause and take any questions or comments that people have. David Ottensasser. So David, I'm going to answer you, even though I know David for a while, but David will unmute you in a minute. I'm going to try to give you an answer. What David wrote is he wants to know why Rav Yosef says there are 3 altars, and then he lists them, 3 altars in Egypt, and then the Gemara says there's nothing else. It seems redundant. So I think the reason the Gemara adds that last clause is because the Gemara is saying having those 3 altars of having the mezuzot, having the post, and having the mashkof, and having the lintel, that worked for sprinkling blood, which is part of the Korban Pesach. That's part of any Korban. It's called Zrikat Hadan, the blood sprinkling. But there was nothing else that they could use to actually put the meat that they were supposed to put, that you usually put for a Korban, to actually give as an offering for God, to God in a symbolic way. So that's what I think he's trying to get at. Other questions or comments about any of this? if you write in the Q&A, we'll get to you. Oh, can we actually, David, do you have anything that you want to say about this? You could, if you want to talk, you could just write it in the Q&A and we'll know to unmute you. You did it right, so I'm assuming not. Okay, David, you'll get back to us if you want. Any other questions or comments about this? No, they won't. We're going to continue. Okay, let's do it. I got to tell you, you can see someone, but I can only see me. So it's interesting. Let's just say it's an interesting way to teach. Okay, what I want to do is I want him, Nachum Tversky wants to talk. That makes me so happy. Nachum Tversky, let's hear you. Michael, can we unmute Nachum? Yeah.
Simple question. If, as you describe it, this korban is very personal, private, and to the home, why the prohibition against notar? That it would seem that you'd want it to last longer and to linger in the privacy of your home.
So I think that this is a hybrid. I think that's exactly what the Rambam, what Maimonides is trying to say, is that what we're looking at here is this is not just a meal. It's a hybrid. This is not just food, right? If we were just talking about food, we would say, what do you mean? Of course. I don't know about you, but I'm saving all the food I have. I don't care what people tell me about groceries being restocked. I'm saving all the food I have, right? But we're not talking about food. We're still talking about a korban. We're still talking about an offering. Wait until we get to what the rabbis do with Korban Pesach to see the food, the meal element shine through in a different kind of way. Okay. Ray, I'm seeing you next. Do you want to? What do you say, Nachum? Say again.
I wasn't talking about the food and the consumption. I was talking about if, as the korban, if there's this kind of transcendent residual benefit that we bring into the privacy of our home, you'd want that element to sustain and to last, not from a consumptive perspective, but from what it represents.
Yeah, I hear that. It's kind of like the questions are better than the answers in the sense that if I was writing the rules, would I write it this way or would I write it that way? What I do know is that actually having a prohibition of the leftovers allows it to be more similar to other korbanot, right? It does allow it to be more similar. But yeah, you could offer all sorts of things, like it's a one-night event and it's celebrating that one night. But I think it's a great question. I think there's more to think about there. Ray, do you want to say, Ray mentions that inside could be very traumatic. Let me tell you something. You see the normal part of the screen, but outside the screen, there's a lot of stuff going on. Isaac Mann asked, and Ray, if you want to say something about that, please feel free, let us know that you'd like to say something. To what extent can we connect what you said about the argument whether one has to finish the korban by chatzot, right? So we have an argument. So Isaac Mann brings up, let's let Isaac ask his question a little bit more in detail. Isaac, can you ask your question? We're going to unmute you. I hope this is going okay for everybody hearing the unmuted. What I hope is that it means that some people are getting to some questions that other people might have too. Yeah, Isaac. We can't hear you. Uh-oh, Isaac, you might be muted. Until you get to what you need to get to, we're gonna wait on that. Wendy Baker asked the question about what about the Gid Anasha, the hindquarters. Not clear exactly when that came into play. That's actually an argument in Mishnah in Tractate Chulin in I think chapter 6 for another time. And somebody Brown with the first name J says, wait a second, I thought the Pesach lamb is in the temple. Didn't we just explain this as an offering that we do at home? No, it is the first time it's ever done. It's an offering that's done at home. In Egypt itself, it's described as an offering given at home. And that's exactly where we're going. It's the perfect segue after Ray. It's the perfect segue to where we're going with the rabbis. How do you maintain some of this at-homeness when actually you do have a temple and you are actually giving the korban, you are actually going in those throngs of people, and most of the action is actually at the temple. The action is not, okay, I eat it afterwards, no big deal. But the action is not at my house, right? So great question, Jay Brown. And if Jay Brown, if you want to say more, let me know. But let's unmute Ray. Isaac, I'm sorry that we can't hear you. If you figure out your muted situation, hopefully we'll be able to. I'm going to take Ray and then I'm going to move on. Ray, go for it. It'll be good to hear your voice. Uh-oh. Is Ray muted? He looks muted.
Ray, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, that's good. So I just
Ray,
wanted to
good to hear you.
Good to hear you too. That the stress of being, even though the danger is outside, the danger and the stress of being inside is enormous, and especially for certain groups, specifically, of course, the elderly, who the confinement in a home environment is terribly stressful, and like the outside, even though there's the threat there, it beckons and one feels this urge to go outside. So it's that balancing the need to be inside to be quote unquote safe, but the urge to be outside because the dangers and the threat of social isolation are so great.
Yes, and I think that in some ways that captures exactly the flip side of the coin of what we call Pesach Mitzrayim, the Paschal Lamb in Egypt. It's not like the Jews are feeling all comfortable and settled and fine inside their houses. They're scared, right? And you're adding a different element that we're feeling today, which is they're isolated. You're isolated. You're by yourself. By the way, you could be in a house with 4 people and you're by yourself, but there are people who are by themselves, right? And from that perspective, to be able to recognize and not just say platitudes of, isn't it nice that the Paschal Lamb is in the home? That's why I don't want it to be just platitudes, because I don't think it is. I think there's also real trauma there, right? And there's something deeply conflicted about having to have this in the home as chaos reigns all around and not being allowed to go out and not being able to go out. So I appreciate the articulation of it in a deep way. I want to move on to what I think the rabbis do they're speaking in a post-temple world, but they're also speaking about the korban, the sacrifice, the way it was done in the temple. And from that perspective, we go back to Jay Brown's question. I don't know Jay's first name, but someone with a J. I don't know if it's Jeffrey, Jeremy, Jared. We can make up all sorts of names for you, Josh. That we go back to Jay Brown's question, which is, wait a second, but we don't have Korban Pesach in our houses every year. Korban Pesach was supposed to be done at the temple. Beautiful. So what I want to point to is what the rabbis do is they actually shift the action. And by action, I mean the excitement, the pinnacle. They shift the action back to the home by focusing on the eating and on the meal. Take a look with me at number 4. We're going to look at 3 examples in which what the rabbis are doing is they are saying, you might think that because this is given in the temple and because this is given in the Mikdash, that it's about temple worship, sacrifices, cultic, communal. But actually, the most important part is the eating. When you get home and eat the food, that is the Korban Pesach, when you take that food home and eat it. Let's take a look at number 4. I'm calling this section sacrifice or meal, because in certain senses, even though, of course, the Korban Pesach was a sacrifice, in the time of the temple, they actually did sprinkle the blood. In the time of the temple, they actually did put the meat onto the mizbeach, onto the altar, only the meats that they weren't allowed to eat, certain fats, but that was considered an offering. But then they came home and ate the rest. So what's the coming home and eating the rest? Is that just, I don't know, not wasting food? What is the significance of that eating? And that's what the rabbis really care about, and they actually transform the way that we think about this. In number 4, we have a Mishnah that describes what happens if a person slaughters the Korban Pesach for the wrong people. What do we mean for the wrong people? Well, for Korban Pesach, there's something very unique in that you have to decide before you even slaughter it, who's your group of people that you're eating it with, okay? So if you slaughter it without that group in mind, or with the wrong people in mind, or by the way, with people in mind who can't eat the Korban Pesach, that Korban Pesach is pasul, it's invalid. Take a look at number 4. I'm going to read it in English and then in Hebrew Aramaic to put us all on the same footing. The Mishnah says, if one slaughtered it, the Korban Pesach, not for those who will eat it, or not for those who were appointed to it, meaning who joined the group, shachato shelo le'ochlav v'shelo le'mnuyav, or for people who haven't been circumcised, who are not, a man is not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach unless he is circumcised, la'arelim, or people who are ritually impure, who also may not eat the Korban Pesach, pasul, it is invalid. And the Gemara explains, what do we mean by you slaughtered the animal not for people who are going to eat it? Who'd you slaughter it for exactly? So the Gemara says, the sages taught in the Tosefta, what does it mean that you slaughtered it for someone who can't eat it? It means you slaughtered it for a sick person or for an older person who wouldn't be able to digest it. What about slaughtering it for someone who didn't register for it, meaning who didn't register to be in your group? If one group registered for it and you slaughtered it for the sake of a different group, then it's invalid. Now notice that. You can't even slaughtering the animal, not for the people who are going to eat it, or for people who can't eat it. Even if you have that in mind, it ruins the korban. It ruins the korban. Why? The Gemara continues. From where do we derive this? In the Aramaic, right across, minahani mile. Well, as the sages taught, the Tanu Rabbanan, the Torah itself says, b'michsat nefashot. It has to be in the group of people. Milamed, that teaches, she'ein ha'pesach nishchat ela limnuyad. It has to be even slaughtered for the group of people that's going to eat it. Okay, fine. So you slaughtered it for people who didn't register. Got it. It has to be for people who didn't register. But what about slaughtering it for people who can't eat it in the name of people who can't eat it? Because remember, you have one ambassador who goes for a group of people. We understand that because of the word b'michsa, in the group or in the number of people, we know that it can't be slaughtered for some group that it wasn't meant for. But what about slaughtering it on behalf of people who can't eat it? Ninalan, how do we know that that's a problem? Amar Kra, the verse says, Ish lefi ochlo tachosu al hafeh, that each person, according to their eating, that's how they should be grouped for the lamb. Itkish ochlin limnuyin, the people who eat and the people in the group have to be the same. They have to be the eaters. Why? Because the focus is on the eating. You don't believe me? Let's go to something that's much clearer, that the eating is actually the whole thing. Take a look at number 6. I'm going to skip with you to number 6, and we'll go back to number 5 in a minute. Nah, actually, let's do number 5. You don't have to believe me yet. I'm mounting my case. And by the way, you'll notice that in number 4, I wrote on the bottom, see also Babylonian Talmud Pesachim 71b for ramifications for Shabbat. I mentioned before that Korban Pesach can be slaughtered on Shabbat. And guess what? If you slaughtered it on Shabbat for people who can't eat it or not for people who can eat it, then you actually violated Shabbat, according to the rabbinic understanding. You violated Shabbat, meaning it's that serious. It's not a korban at all. It's gone. It's done. Okay. Number 5. What about owning chametz? The Torah says, "Lo tishchat al chametz dam zivchi." You cannot slaughter upon chametz. I'm putting upon in quotes. The blood of my offering, God says. Meaning, you can't own chametz even when you slaughter, okay? You can't own chametz even when you slaughter. So the Mishnah says in number 5, hashochet et hapesach, someone who slaughters the Korban Pesach, remember they'd be slaughtering on behalf of other people, al hachametz, but they do it on chametz, it doesn't literally mean they do it on leavened bread. It means somebody owns chametz when this happens. Over below ta'aseh, they have violated a negative commandment. So the Gemara wants to know, well, wait a second. There's a lot of people in this situation. There's the person who's doing the slaughtering. There's the people who are registered to eat. Do all of them have to not own chametz when the slaughtering goes on? Well, you tell me. If the real action, if the excitement is actually what goes on in the temple, which is the slaughtering and the offering and the blood sprinkling, then probably the people who can't own chametz are the people who are doing those things, right? Whether it's the person doing the slaughtering, which is probably an average Jew, or the people doing the blood sprinkling, which were Kohanim, priests. But if the focus is actually on the food and on the eating, then maybe it's also the people who are going to eat this thing who also are not going to be allowed to own chametz when this is happening. And Isaac Van, I saw that you put in your question. We're going to go back to you. I apologize that we couldn't get to you right there. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Oshaya asks Rabbi Ami, and just to say that God willing, when this is all over, we should all be able to have Talmud from the balcony where you're sitting with a chavruta, where you're sitting with a study partner, and you're learning through these sources with your study partner, and you're trying to make heads and tails of them, and you're trying to think about them, where I don't have to tell you, oh, this is what it means, but actually you come to your own understanding of what it means. We should all be able to do that together one day, I hope. Rabbi Oshaya asked Rabbi Ami, what if the person doing the slaughtering doesn't own chametz, but one of the members of the eating group does own chametz? Then what is the ruling? He said, well, it doesn't say you can't slaughter the Korban Pesach on your chametz. It says you can't slaughter Korban Pesach on any chametz, meaning if there's anyone's chametz. So then he says, well, then maybe if there's anyone in the entire world who owns chametz, you wouldn't be allowed to do the slaughtering. And you have to make sure that every Jew has gotten rid of their chametz. And he says, no. The Torah says, don't slaughter when you have chametz. It also says, don't leave your Korban Pesach overnight. And those two things are connected to each other. And so the people who aren't allowed to leave their Korban Pesach overnight, namely the eaters of the Korban Pesach, are the ones who also aren't allowed to own chametz when you slaughter it, right? So as Jody points out, she loves all the what ifs that the rabbis come up with. Why do the rabbis come up with what ifs? They come up with what ifs because they're trying to prove something to you. They're trying to explain to you that you might think that really the Korban Pesach is about the temple, and really it's about being out there in public with the whole Jewish people. But actually the eating itself matters a great deal. And so the eaters who aren't there at the temple, but are sitting at home and waiting, the eaters themselves, they're not allowed to own chametz either. My third example, right? So the first example was that if you slaughter the animal, not for the sake of those who are going to be eating it, or specifically for the sake of people who won't eat it, it's an invalid Korban Pesach. It's gone. Doesn't matter if you didn't do it. Second, there's a violation of owning chametz when the Korban Pesach is slaughtered, not only for the person doing the slaughtering, but for the people who are going to eat. And the third, and this I think is sort of like the ringer, okay, that shows us that actually the eating really, really matters, is actually about ritual impurity. So if you were with me till now and you said, all right, listen, she's going to talk about the Paschal Lamb. I'm not a big fan of Korbanot. I don't want to think about that. But you know what? I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. We know each other. We don't know each other. I'm looking at the math thing that she has in the background on her wall in her kid's toy room. Something's keeping me here. But now when I say ritual impurity, you're like, oh, I'm out of here. Don't. say there's philosophy, there's something, there's depth here, okay? You have to understand something. We now are in a moment where I would say, Pesach, it feels like it's canceled. Just it feels, that's how it feels. You're not going to be in synagogue. You're not going to have the grandparents. You're not going to have the grandkids. You're not going to have the little kid. You might not even have anybody else. It feels canceled. It feels canceled. The rabbis ask, what if the majority of the Jewish people, or the majority of the Kohanim, of the priests, who are supposed to do the offering part of the sacrifice, or the majority of the vessels in the temple are ritually impure? And they're talking about a particular ritual impurity, which is impurity connected to death and contacting the corpse. And they're not able to do the Korban Pesach. What do? What if it seems like Pesach is going to have to be canceled? Because the Korban Pesach can't be done. If somebody's ritually impure, it can't be done. And so they have the most magnificent concept that when it comes to korbanot that have a certain time, that if the majority, not individuals, if the majority of the Jewish people are ritually impure because of some contact with death, or the majority of the Kohanim are ritually impure because of some contact with death, or the majority of the vessels in the Beit HaMikdash are ritually impure because of some contact with death, you have to imagine what kind of calamity they're thinking about. If this were to be the case, they're obviously thinking about something where death would be pervasive and people would be contacting it in many different ways, whether a war or a famine or a plague or, God forbid, any of these. What happens? They say, Tum'ah hutra b'tzibur, that Tum'ah, the impurity, is allowed if it's affecting the majority of the community, the majority of the nation. And if that is the case, that means that you can give that korban, whether any korban that has a time when it's supposed to be given, right? You have a korban for Shavuot. You have to give that korban, even though everybody, so many people are commanded. Usually we don't come to the Mikdash, we don't come to the temple with Tum'ah. Tum'ah is a source of death. The temple is supposed to be a place of immortality. We don't do that. But when it comes to these korbanot that have specific days and represent the whole community, we don't cancel them. That's not a thing we do. We don't cancel them. We allow them to go on. And yet, for every other example, except for the Korban Pesach, if we allow a korban to be given when the majority of the community is tameh, is ritually impure, specifically as a result of contact with death, every other example, they may not eat that korban. Whatever is given in the Mikdash, in the temple, is given, but they may not eat that korban. You know what the only exception is? Korban Pesach. If you do it when everybody's tameh, you also eat it. And that's our Mishnah in number 6. See, I told you this is going to be like the bell ringer, okay? There are 5 items that are brought in impurity but are not to be eaten in impurity. Now, there aren't only 5 items, but we're going to leave it right now, okay? And it gives the example of the 5 items. The Korban Omer, which is given on the 2nd day of Pesach for a different conversation. The Shtei Lechem, the 2 loaves, which are given on Shavuot. The Lechem HaPanim, the showbread, the 12 loaves of bread that went in the Mikdash all the time. The Zivchei Shalmei Tzibur, again, we're not going to talk about this, but it's also korbanot that are given on Shavuot. The Irei Roshei Chodeshim, and the special offering that was given on Rosh Chodesh on the 1st of the month. But those things, they may be brought in impurity. You can give the sacrifice, but they may not be eaten in impurity. Nobody may eat them. HaPesach, but the Paschal lamb, Sheba B'tum'ah, that is given, that is offered in the Mikdash, in the temple, in its state of impurity, ne'echal b'tumah. It can also be eaten in impurity. In that case, I'm not talking about where individuals are talking about. That's why we have what's called Pesach Sheni for another conversation. But why? Shelo ba mitchilato ela la'achila. Because the whole point of the Paschal Lamb is the eating. The whole point of it. The only reason we ever brought it was for people to eat it. Wow. Wow. There are many other examples of this in the Gemara, in Pesachim, in the tractates. And you know what? You're learning, you see this, and you say, technical, not technical. The rabbis over and over again are trying to push us not to think about the home, not the home. Biblically, it's the home. In Egypt, it's the home, it's the bayit. The rabbis are pushing us to the eating, to the food, to the achilah. And I'd like to make a suggestion. What? And then we'll get to the Q&A, don't worry. I'd like to get to a suggestion as to why they're doing that. I think there are two reasonable explanations, one of which I think really matters for right now. One very reasonable explanation, I think, is that, and I hope you have ideas too, and I'm sure you have ideas too. And if you don't have ideas now, I bet you'll wake up in the middle of the night with an idea. You'll wake up tomorrow, or you'll say, good, send them to me, email them to me. There's nothing, I mean, what are we doing in life if all we're doing is worrying? We need some things that sort of bring us out of that. But one reason is just to imitate what they did in the biblical story. Meaning, yeah, of course. Meaning part of the idea is that they were supposed to sit in their homes and they were supposed to eat the food and they were supposed to, eat the food with all their stuff on and ready to go. And so we're kind of imitating what they do. Actually, it's three reasons. The second reason is possibly just that actually the rabbis are living in a post-temple world. And I understand that they're talking about when the temple stood, but the focus on the eating, it actually does put the focus back in the home a bit. It does put the focus back on the meal and the conversation, right? Where the Haggadah does the same. But I think there's a third that's become, I was thinking about this last year already, and it's become much more important to me this year, which is, what is it that the Jewish people complain about throughout the entire Bible? They're wandering in the desert. What do they complain about? They always complain, we don't have food. We don't have food. We need food. We don't have food. Yeah, they also say we don't have water. We don't have food. We remember when we ate this great food in Egypt. Food. I would like to suggest, and maybe it's poetic license for the rabbis, I don't know, but I would like to suggest that the focus on the eating, aside from being a really smart read of the Bible, because clearly it's not an offering the way that everything else is an offering, right? But the focus on the eating in some ways reminds us that forget everything else. What a bunch of freed slaves need is they need a guarantee that they will have food to eat. They need a guarantee that their basic needs are going to be taken care of. They don't need a highfalutin philosophical or theological understanding of the world that suddenly hits them. They need to know they're going to have a meal when their master is not giving it to them. They need something else. And so I look at the idea of the Korban Pesach that I think runs through biblical Korban Pesach and rabbinic Korban Pesach as something that essentially says that the first promise of God to the Jewish people upon the Exodus is, I will feed you. I will make sure that you don't starve, even in this new, uncertain reality. I want to take some questions because I see that there's been things that have come up. So Isaac Mann from all the way back when, Isaac was all the way back at 8:30. Thank you for sticking with it, right? There is an argument between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva as to whether you can eat the Korban Pesach all night or only until midnight. Is that related at all to the question of whether the destroyer who's described in the Bible is out all night punishing firstborns, or whether only until the middle of the night? So it's a good question. The Gemara there actually connects it to the question of when exactly they left. The side, and I don't remember, I think it's Rabbi Eliezer, but I don't remember, the side that says that it's only until midnight is actually connecting it specifically to the fact that it was sort of at midnight when the Makat Bechorot, sort of like the Makat Bechorot reaches the crescendo, the sense that, okay, we've got to kick these people out already. So that's that. But there's probably more to say on a philosophical, but I'm not ready to do that. Micah Bloomfield, who violates the negative commandment, the slaughterer, the registered person who has the chametz? We're going to leave that for another time because we have many people listening. But the short of it is, I don't remember. So I'm leaving it for another time because I actually don't remember. When we say at the beginning of the Seder, let all who are hungry come and eat, how can we do this if they need to register ahead of time? Isn't it too late? So when we say all who are hungry come and eat, in some ways that's actually a way of saying we're post-temple, right? That is by the, I believe, it's by the Babylonian Geonim, so it's hundreds of years later, and it really shows that we're no longer in Korban Pesach land where you had to have your pre-registered groups. Beautiful. If you become ritually impure between the slaughter and the eating, is the whole thing invalid? I don't believe so, because as long as it was slaughtered for somebody who is ritually pure, and you probably just wouldn't be able to join the group. Why is there a second opportunity a month later for Pesach Sheni? There's a second opportunity because if not the majority of the community or the majority of the priests or the majority of the vessels in the Mikdash were impure, but it was actually a minority of people or just individuals, they themselves get a chance to make this up the next month. Okay. So let me just say what we've done so far. Okay. And we have 10 minutes left. I'm not sure if we're going to use it. What we've done so far, and I can't even see your faces, so it's hard to know. But what we've done so far is we have asked ourselves, what is the transcendence of the Korban Pesach? What is it trying to do? And we've suggested two different things. One thing that we've suggested that it is trying to do is it is trying to get the focus on the home. The biblical Korban Pesach gets the focus on the home, whether that is because the Jewish home should be a place of sanctity, whether that is because the home is a refuge, or because actually at that moment they were so narrowed to their homes that they couldn't go anywhere else. And that is actually a source of trauma. But I think both sides of the coin. The second, I think, big message of Korban Pesach is that Korban Pesach is not just about an offering. It's not an offering like any other offering, but it's actually an offering that has within it, that contains within it a promise and a divine promise that we will have our basic necessities. And when I look at that aspect of the Korban Pesach, I think a lot about this year. Because I have to be honest, I think many of us, all we want is just the normalcy of being able to walk outside without a mask on. All we want is the normalcy of being able to visit family and friends. We're not asking for something redemptive in the most transcendent form of the word. We're asking for basic necessities. And I think that the Korban Pesach, having that Korban Pesach in mind as we have our Seder, is actually, in some ways, it's a plea. In some ways, it's a petition. In some ways, it's a holding God responsible. It's essentially saying, this is the promise of Pesach. The promise of Pesach is not just freedom. It's not just Torah, all these just, but it's that we'll just have some normalcy, even though what's coming is uncertain. And I suppose I would end with just the following point. If you look in our story of how people told stories about Pesach, because our Haggadah, it doesn't have stories about the Exodus. it has a little, but it has stories about people telling stories, which is interesting in and of itself, right? So you have like the famous group of 5 who are sitting around in Bnei Brak, and they're talking about the story of the Exodus all night. They're up all night talking the story of the Exodus, right? That story that they're telling all night is not the only story, because there's another version in rabbinic literature that's not in our Haggadah, and that other version is not people talking about the story of the Exodus all night. It is, which redemptive and big, but it's people actually learning the laws of the Korban Pesach all night. In the Tosefta, which is early rabbinic source, in the Tosefta, we have a story of Rabbi Gamliel and his compatriots. That's what they're doing all night. They're learning about the Korban Pesach. And I really hope that in our very difficult, and I hope also joyous experience of Pesach, that we are able to focus on the fact that this is a moment for us to celebrate normalcy and to petition for it at the same time. This is a moment for us to be able to be reflective about both the refuge that we're able to take in our homes and the fear that we have of what is outside. It is not a simple Pesach. It is not a simple Pesach, and I hope that next year's Pesach will be much simpler. I hope that next year's Pesach, the messages will be much easier to swallow. But for this year, there's a lot that we have to talk about at the table, not just with others, but with ourselves. And I hope that the Pesach Seder, I hope that that night will be a night when we will be able to experience that kind of reflection, that kind of humanity, and that kind of hope. Thank you so much. Wishing you all a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a Risen Pesach to everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good night.